Hey, John, I'm gonna go ahead. Okay. Welcome, everybody. And we have a special guest. Congressman Garcia is going to be introducing Bill Richardson. I'm Simon Rosenberg from NDN and the New Policy Institute. This project is really this event today is the work of several of our different projects here coming together. We have a project called the 21st Century Border Initiative, which has been funded largely by the Ford Foundation, which has been working for years on looking at telling a more accurate story about the realities of the U.S. Mexico border and our relationship with Mexico in the public sphere. We've had a clean energy project here that's several years old as well that does a lot of work. And John Grant, who really did most of the work today, is the head of something called the Next Economy Partnership Project, which is looking at a new way at looking at local economic development. And if everyone can put their phones on vibrate or turn off. And when we get to Q&A, remember that this is being recorded, and it means it will be on the internet for all time, right? So one of the things we'd like you to do when you ask questions is just identify yourself and make sure there's a mic in front of you so the audience listening live or in the future can hear you. We have a very full set of panelists today and speakers, so I'm just going to be very brief. And in fact, I'm going to skip the introductions to save time. Many of the folks who are speaking today are incredibly well known and very thoughtful and on these issues, and I'll do it very quick. First, we're going to hear from Governor Bill Richardson. Doesn't really need a big introduction. What's important to me about the governor is that my wife is from New Mexico, and so I've been able to spend a lot of time with him in a state that I've my adopted state that I've come to love. We also had the same advisor at Tufts University, 15 years apart. I won't tell you who went there first at Tufts, but we have a lot of connections, love of baseball, love of New Mexico, our time we spent at Tufts. And Governor is a good friend. We've done a lot of work together for many, many years. He's going to be here to share his reflections on the subject about the idea of a North American energy community and the changing landscape of energy in North America. And I hope all of you got to see him the other day and meet the press. He was terrific. Hopefully there'll be more of those in the future, Governor. We're next going to hear from Duncan Wood. For those of you who follow anything about U.S. and Mexico, you all know Duncan. He's very charming and interesting and thoughtful interpreter of what's happening in Mexico today from the Wilson Center. He's done, what's one of the great things about Duncan for this conversation today is he went to school in Canada, taught and lived in Mexico, and is now here in the United States. So his perspective on North America, I think, is deep and broad, and I think will be adding so much to the conversation. He's also written a lot about energy, and we'll be doing a little bit of a deep dive in what's happening in Mexico regarding energy reform. And then finally, Rick Van Schoik, our great partner. He and his partner, Eric Lee, have been working with us for years now on our border project. He's started a new entrepreneurial adventure that he's on now, Rick. He and Eric have started something called the North American, I want to get it right, the North American Research Partnership, right, which he just started. He lives in San Diego. Eric is in Phoenix, and two of the smartest and most thoughtful authors and researchers we know on North America and U.S. Mexico. Rick's a former Navy SEAL and just a super thoughtful commentator, particularly on these energy issues. He's been pounding us to have this event for years, so in many ways we're doing this because of Rick hounding us for many years now. So thank you for coming. It's going to be a terrific event. To introduce Governor Richardson is my very good friend, the spirited, talented, charismatic, thoughtful congressman from South Florida, Congressman Garcia, and former NDN staffer. Right, welcome, Joe. Thank you.
Once a staffer, always a staffer. So before I start, I'd obviously like to recognize Ambassador Sarukan, who did such a wonderful job of, it's always watching Ambassador Sarukan's initiation into American politics in terms of his press conference where he spoke the King's English was just an impressive feat. And I also wanted to recognize Marty Chavez, former mayor of Albuquerque and a good friend of this organization and mine. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Bill Richardson, a friend of many years, a man who's invested time and time again in my campaigns, and finally it paid off. But he's a man who's dedicated his life to public service, serving as ambassador to the United Nations, energy secretary, governor, congressman. This is one guy who just can't hold a job. But as a diplomat, as a governor, Bill understands firsthand how important the U.S. Mexico relationship is to our national security, to our economy, and to our future. Because of his leadership and the work of his organization, the U.S. Mexico border today is safer, more secure, more prosperous than ever before. Two-way trade is approaching $500 billion annually, more than 4 times what it was 20 years ago. This is an exciting time in discussing the future of the U.S. Mexico relationship. There is no question that the ongoing debate about comprehensive immigration is critically important as part of that future in that relationship. We need a common sense reform that promotes travel, trade, and tourism, because it is essential not only to our prosperity, but that of Mexico. I want to thank, in particular, Bill Richardson's strong leadership on this issue. I also want to mention Bill, aside from being on Meet the Press, he recently spent over an hour with the Mexican President, Peña Nieto, and I'm sure that we'll be able to, without much prodding, extract all the particulars of that. With that, I'll turn things over to Bill and just say, you know, one of the things that I always think this administration lacked is having Bill Richardson in the cabinet. There is no one that shakes up things more and moves the debate forward. I'll end with a story. I've never been able to go to Cuba, and I've studied Cuba policy my entire life, and so once through the grapevine, I found out that Bill was going to Cuba, and so I said, Bill, take me as your advisor. And Bill said, well, I don't think they'll let me. So well, ask. And of course, Bill is never satisfied with asking exactly what you ask, so he goes a little bit further. And so in his list, he selected people who were not on any type of terms with Cuba. I'm always on bad terms with Cuba. And so when Bill called me back, I said, well, did you get it? He said, well, Joe, here's what they said. They said they'd deport you, they'd arrest your friend, and the other guy I invited, they'd shoot at the airport. So I almost made it to Cuba with Bill. I know I'll be able to do it sooner or later. With that, my good friend, Bill Richardson.
Thank you. That is a true story. You know, first thing I want to say is how young all of you look. Maybe I'm getting older, but every time I come to Washington, everybody's younger. And except for my friend, Mayor Chavez, who's a great Albuquerque mayor, and Patsy, and the ambassador, and Simon. You know, in the end, let me give credit to this organization. They talk about issues that are important, that are maybe 5 years away, that are imminent, and the work they do in immigration on Latin American policy. So give a big hand to Simon and his team. This is very... And Joe Garcia, did he leave? Jeez. No, I mean, this guy, he wanted to be a congressman so badly, he did it. But it was persistence. You know, young people, you want to get into politics. You know what? You may lose the first time. You may lose the second time. It's better to win than to lose. But Joe lost a couple of times, but he's there and he's making a difference. And there's nothing more noble than public service. And I hope those of you that are here from schools or think tanks, or that you consider public service in your community, in your state, in the federal government, something that I think is very, very worthwhile. My main message is that I think the moment is there for North America energy community. A NAFTA on energy between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. I think what we need to do is look at the future. look at what will make the three countries energy self-sufficient. Look geopolitically what makes sense. When I was energy secretary under President Clinton, I used to go around the OPEC countries, you know, the 12 OPEC countries, the Saudis, the Algerians, Nigerians, begging almost for them to increase production of oil because we wanted the price to go down. At the time, when I was energy secretary, the price was $10 a barrel. 10. Then it went up to 30 and there was a panic. So when it went up to 30, I would try to get these countries to increase production. The price would go down. We were totally dependent on OPEC. We had no energy policy. Oil and gas extraction was almost non-existent. There was no such thing as renewables. Yeah, some people were solar, wind, biofuels. Natural gas was stagnant. But then what's happened since in three countries, in America, in Mexico, and in the region, I think calls for this North American energy community. And here's what's happened, and then I'll tell you why it makes sense for the national security of our country and the region. Number one, what's happened in the United States on our energy policy? We got lucky. It wasn't because of comprehensive energy policy in the Congress. I think President Obama tried, but the Congress wouldn't give him the comprehensive energy policy that he wanted, that included a renewable portfolio standard, certain percentage every state, move in the right direction, energy efficiency measures. But what happened in the last few years in America is two things. One was unbridled discoveries of oil and natural gas, particularly shale gas. Now, there's some dangers with the fracking, but that huge abundance of this cheaper fuel just came out of the ground. The second thing that happened was energy efficiency measures throughout the country. Fuel standards, lead buildings, fuel vehicles, natural gas vehicles, a whole string of energy efficiency initiatives, mainly done by the private sector, mainly done by schools, by communities, by local people. So what did that mean? That mean that the International Energy Agency came out with a report about a year ago that said that the United States will be energy self-sufficient by the year 2020, and that we will be the biggest producers of natural gas and oil, more than Saudi Arabia. So we got lucky, even though we desperately need climate change legislation to clean up the planet, and we need a comprehensive energy policy that allows a policy that gives us an opportunity to develop especially our renewable resources, especially a lot of other energy efficiency measures, especially climate change, what I think is desperately needed. All you have to do is look at the heat waves everywhere and say that they're caused by something. So this is what's happened in the United States. In other words, the days of the cartels, the OPECs, the Irans, the Venezuelas, the countries hostile to us within OPEC trying to manipulate the price. I'm not saying they don't pose a threat anymore, but they're much less of a threat. Not just to the United States, but also to the international community. And the reason we can't say that OPEC is not a threat, many of those countries are our friends, the Saudis, the UAE, many others, is that I think it's important that we recognize that Japan and countries in Europe and Africa are still dependent on the energy that comes from the Middle East. So you can't say, okay, we're okay in America, but our allies are not okay, so the hell with them. I mean, we're an international community, and we have to work together, especially on energy prices. Now, the second development that I think is important for this North America energy community, it's what's happening in Mexico. And that is something that was started by Arturo and his president But now he gets a little antsy when I say too many nice things about the new president. No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. But I said some great thing. I called him the best ambassador in history of the world, so he can't be too upset. But I think this guy, Peña Nieto's got the right stuff. You know, I've seen a lot of politicians down the pike, but I think this guy's got the right stuff. He's got political skills, he's got an intellect, he's got a vision, and most importantly, he's got results. If you look at his presidency in the first 4 months, and I'm half Mexican, okay, so I have a bias, but I'm tired over the years of criticizing everybody dumping on Mexico, the cartels, travel, don't go there. I'm sick of that. But now I think there's a resurgence of pride, not just in Mexico, but in an America that can look at Mexico as a real partner, as an economic partner, not just as a country that brings the flow of people to us, which, by the way, I want to commend Simon and the work that Simon does and NDN does on the immigration bill. We got to get this done. All of you should call one Republican you know and get them to vote for it, in the House especially, even if they won't let you in the door. Stay at the door. But that's going to be the key. I'm not funny. I know one laughs at me. Patsy, why don't they laugh at me? They don't laugh at my jokes anymore. So this is what I believe is happening in Mexico. Energy reform. Now, it's not going to be a wholesale sale of Pemex. It's not going to be privatization. It's going to be partnerships. And if you read Peña Nieto's speech to the Congress, the focus is green energy. And what Pemex is doing, and I've had conversations with their very able secretary, they're talking about renewables, biofuels, besides oil and natural gas. They're talking about partnerships in the Gulf, drilling partnerships, safe drilling. They're talking about renewable energy on the border. They're talking about natural gas cooperation and partnerships, not just with American companies, but with all kinds of nations. And you know why I think it's important, what Peña Nieto's doing? Because he's going to get it passed. This guy has the political skills with an initiative he launched very early on called Pacto de México, or Pacto con México, por México, where he got all the parties together and he said, we got to do these major reforms, telecommunications, labor, energy together. And he's going to get it done. You know why? Because if you look at the proposal by the PAN, they have a similar proposal to the PRI, and that's like a huge majority in the Congress. So it's going to happen. And I believe you will see substantial Mexico energy leadership in the region and within the United States and Canada. So I think it makes sense with this very propitious moment. Canada's a major player. You know, Canada always gets ignored. We take them for granted, but they're major producers. And they've got good innovative policies. You know, some of the provinces overdo some of the nuclear stuff, which I'm not a big fan of. But they've got creative policies, they're innovative, their universities have a lot of good technology. So again, because of new technologies in America and this good luck we had, I think America can step into this North American new energy relationship, new energy structure. Mexico, because an energy reform that I think will pass, and this is not all going to be instantaneous. It's not going to happen tomorrow or maybe not even next year. It's going to take a little time. But then I think there's an opportunity for the three of us to look at some, I won't call it NAFTA, because NAFTA is about products. I think it's partnership. It's having grids, some common grids. It's having some common renewable energy initiatives, having some private sector partnerships. It's not just all government, because as we know, you try to get something done in the Congress that requires legislation, it's going to be very hard to do. Also means tackling issues like water that I think are critically important to our country, to Mexico, to the region, and it's part of any kind of energy debate. So that's my main message here. What other developments are we looking at in the region that we have to be very conscious of? One, Venezuela. Venezuela is an important country, oil producer. But we don't know with the new leadership whether they are going to be willing to pursue the policies of Chavez of extending very sweetheart deals to almost every country in the hemisphere, especially in the Caribbean. They probably can't afford to do that. So I think we have to watch that energy development, which is it's a subtraction of resources that existed there, unless all of a sudden Venezuela has new discoveries. They're a very rich country. And I think the U.S. Venezuela relationship, one of my goals has been to try to repair it, try to get it so we have a dialogue and we go back and forth. And when I was there at the election, I was an OAS observer. Well, I wasn't an observer. They don't call them observers. I was the representative secretary general. The president, who is now president, his foreign minister, said, hey, we want to improve relations with the U.S. I said, well, it'd help if you stop calling us names. It would, and by the way, this Snowden thing, I hope it doesn't screw things up. I'm totally against what Snowden did. I think our government is right in pursuing what they did. He deserves to be prosecuted. But at the same time, we've got Bolivia, we've got Ecuador, we've got, and we're talking about the region, we've got Nicaragua and Venezuela, 4 countries that we're not getting along terribly well with them. And I think a way to bridge the gap with those 4 countries, you know what it is? Energy. Energy, renewable energy. Find ways to improve the political relationship with some renewable energy, climate change ties, ways that innovation, businessmen, young people, universities, governments work together. The second point that I would make for the region is what I'd love to see is a renewable energy agreement, a NAFTA renewable energy agreement among all countries. If you look at a majority of countries in the region, almost a total majority, they are committed to saying that in the year 2040, their main source of energy, they want it to be renewable. So what we need to do with the solar energy boom that exists today is take advantage of that and find ways with the region, and we need to pay more attention to our region, to look at a renewable energy relationship. So I'm proposing a lot of things, I know, and it's, you have a luxury when you're out of government. By the way, I love being out of government. I don't want to go back in. I'm doing good. In fact, my taxes are a little high. I got to talk to Marty Chavez about that. Get this tax rate down. No, I'm kidding. But again, geopolitically, energy security is critically important. And we have to look at the future. And I do think the future is in our region. And this North American energy relationship, we should move forward and try to find ways after Mexico gets their legislation passed to nurture some very common ties, not just oil and gas, but in hydrocarbons and renewables and in energy innovation and energy efficiency. I mean, we've done good on energy efficiency. And the region, I think our technology in the energy efficiency area with vehicles, with buses, as Marty Chavez did some great things in Albuquerque before anyone was thinking about these fuel-efficient buses. He was hauling everybody in these buses, which they didn't run. No, I'm kidding. They did. Jesus, no one laughs at me. Silent. Everyone's playing with their BlackBerry. By the way, I don't live here, so I can be cynical. So I'm going to close with this. What I think we need to do is find ways that, once again, nothing is easy. When I talk about the shale gas revolution, that's probably, as I go around conferences and give speeches, by the way, I get paid a lot more than Simon just paid me. I had to pay myself. Is There are dangers. There's environmental dangers to shale gas. It's called fracking. But we can do it with technology, with proper regulation. You know, the oil and gas companies, they say, oh, leave us alone. You know, we know how to do it. Yeah, right. EPA, local communities, but I think we have the technology to do that. Make these companies disclose their chemicals. If it takes a little time, you do it. And this is going to be worldwide. When I was just in Europe, we're going to have a free trade agreement, U.S. and Europe, even though in Europe there's some countries banning fracking. They want to see this new shale gas opportunity. And we have the technology there, and we have the expertise. So this is a form of leverage for us. But I'm sticking to the region, and I will conclude. North America Energy Community. Let's move forward with that. Canada, Mexico, the U.S. Not a NAFTA-style agreement that focuses on cooperation, on common grids, on common policies. That's what I would do. Second, a renewable energy agreement with the whole region. Caribbean countries can probably take the lead because they have some really serious advances there. The third thing is we need to improve our ties with countries in Latin America we're not getting along with. Do it through energy. Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua. Start with energy, energy exchanges, renewable energy, energy innovation, energy efficiency. We need to rebuild that relationship. And I'm saying our position on Snowden was the right one. I'm not asking for a change in that, but we have to look to our future. You know, it's not good in our own hemisphere not to have much support other than Mexico and Colombia and Peru, Brazil once in a while. You know, you want to get some votes like you're trying to get something done. And then lastly, and this is not related to this, I think we need in the region, I'd like to see the Obama administration pursue a labor and environmental agreement across the board, regional, labor rights, environmental rights, like we did with Panama, like we did with, what's the other country in the region we did the trade agreement? Not Mexico. El Salvador? Colombia. So, anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see you all. I'm glad that my comments are going to fit in so nicely with what you just said. First of all, a clarification. 2.5 weeks ago, I was married, and on Tuesday morning, I showed up at the office with this on my nose, and my wonderful assistant, Alison Cordell, says, looks like the honeymoon's over. But in fact, that's not the reason. The first rule of Fight Club, you don't talk about Fight Club, okay? Second rule of Fight Club, et cetera, et cetera. I believe that we're at a very important moment in history in terms of energy policy and energy strategy in the region. If you're a student of energy, as I am, you look at the history of the development of energy and human development, and you see a number of revolutions that have taken place over the centuries or over the millennia. The first one was, of course, the shift from entirely human energy, in other words, feeding ourselves so that we could work, to harnessing animals and using their energy for our productivity. The next big revolution was, of course, to harness solid fuels, to burn them for sources of energy. And that continued all the way through until we developed a way to industrially mine coal and to apply that to the Industrial Revolution. It was coal which drove the Industrial Revolution, remember. And then we saw the shift from solid fuels to liquid fuels. And that is the shift from coal to petroleum products. And that was a major revolution driving the development of the 20th century, as well as many unpleasant events. And we're on the verge right now of a shift once again from liquid fuels right now into gas fuels. Wind, and of course natural gas, and eventually hydrogen. That's where we are. And this is the big revolution that's happening right now. But there are other revolutions which are taking place right now which are more specific to our region. And of course those revolutions were alluded to by the governor already. the shale revolution, which I'll talk a little bit about, and the revolution in thinking which is taking place in Mexico. Because that revolution which is taking place in Mexico, combined with the emergence of energy self-sufficiency, energy independence, whatever we call it, in North America, and in particular for the United States, is going to drive the future of energy policy and the potential for the development of energy markets in this region. If we go back 5 years, we see a dramatically different situation. If you look at the three countries of the region, you see that 5 years ago, in 2008, Canada was an energy exporter, a significant energy exporter, but predominantly to the United States. A largely free market, and I say largely free market because there is a heavy role for the regulator in different provinces, not so much in Alberta, where most of Canada's energy is produced, which has a largely sort of free market honor system approach to regulation. But the state still plays a major role, and in the time of soaring oil prices in the recent past, in fact, the Canadian government has sought to take its share, what it sees as its fair share of tax revenue from the oil industry. Dramatically increasing production taking place in Alberta. Alberta looking at the possibility of producing as much as 5.5 million barrels a day within the next 20 years. Abundant markets for Canadian exports. Well, abundant markets in the United States, and the possibility, of course, of looking eastwards to China. And, of course, that brings us to the question about Keystone today and that wonderful Canadian retort when, Keystone is put on hold. And they say, well, I guess we have to ask the Chinese if they want to buy our oil. And that possibility, of course, is not as easy as that. But that idea that, in fact, Canada needs to look beyond the United States. The United States of America, an energy importer 5 years ago. A largely free market. I say largely free market because, of course, we like to think that this is an entirely free market-driven system here, but it's not. There are serious restrictions, of course, and there are serious subsidies as well, which is important to remember in our oil and gas industries. Decreasing production, which was the case for many, many years back in 2008. We'd seen that gradually dropping or rapidly dropping at various points in time. And the big question back in 2008 with regards to energy security was, where can we find reliable suppliers? And that's why Canada and Mexico seem so important. Mexico, which at the time was exporting over 1 million barrels a day to the United States. Canada, the single largest exporter to the United States of oil, desperately trying to make sure that Saudi Arabia remained a reliable supplier, questioning the relationship with Venezuela. How long could that go on? Was there the possibility of Venezuelan oil exports being cut off for the United States? In Mexico 5 years ago, an energy exporter, significant, as I said, over 1 million barrels a day, a closed state-run system dominated by the principle of nationalism and this connection between hydrocarbons and state sovereignty. Trace it going way back to, of course, the period of Porfirio Diaz and the problems that emerged then, and then, of course, the nationalization of 1938. But a situation of decreasing production. Decreasing production, which was becoming rather critical and leads us to where we are today, and with one major export market, the United States. Move on to the next slide, which is today, if we can, thank you, 2013. This is the pivotal moment in the modern history of this region, I would say. If we look at where we are today, Canada is still an energy exporter, largely free market, increasing production, and thinking about that need to diversify markets. The United States, an energy importer, but with energy independence, self-sufficiency on the horizon. A dynamic free market emerging, the role, of course, of the small and medium-sized operators in the development not just of shale gas, but of tight oil across the country, adding up to 1 million barrels a day of production. Rapidly increasing production, which is dramatically changing the way that we think about hydrocarbons in this country. Every day it's less and less about finding ways in which we can import energy. It's about finding ways in which we can extract our own energy from underneath the ground, from underneath the ocean, and looking into the future for export markets. And that last question, are we actually going to be in a position where we can export? And the first question comes up with, of course, regards to LNG, liquefied natural gas. And then, of course, we're looking at, ultimately, when we get to that point when we have excess oil, are we going to be allowed to export that oil? And that's going to be a crucial debate in this country. And the third leg of the current panorama, Mexico. An energy exporter, but for how long? Unless there is a serious revolution in Mexican energy policy, the crossing point between rising national demand and decreasing national production comes around 2018, 2020. If the energy reform is successful this year, and I share Governor Richardson's enthusiasm about that and optimism about that, then I think that that's the opportunity where you see these numbers turning around. The prospects of reform, I think at this point in time, and I'll be happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, the prospects of reform are incredibly encouraging right now. The governor mentioned the PAN proposal, the opposition PAN party's proposal, which came out last week. That's an incredible proposal. It shifts the goalpost. Rather, it shows how the goalposts of the energy reform debate in Mexico have changed. 5 years ago, the prospect of concessions for oil exploration was never on the table. The PAN just put it on the table. The government is not going to go there. That's far too far, outside of the box right now for the government to go. But it means that they can now adopt a moderate position between what the PAN has proposed and what the left-wing PRD has proposed, which is still essentially a largely state-run system with some opening in petrochemicals and in refining. But the government now has a very wide political space in which it can put its proposal on the table in the early fall, probably at the beginning of September, where it can say, we're not ready to go down to concessions, but we know we need to change the system. And what are we going to do? It's going to be about joint ventures. It's going to be about profit sharing or maybe even production sharing agreements, predominantly in the Gulf of Mexico. If we do see a concessions regime emerge, it will be specifically designed for shale gas and shale oil in Mexico. And that, of course, is going to be of enormous interest to the folks down in Texas who are already exploiting the Eagle Ford Formation, which crosses the border. Mexico's one major market, the United States of America, is a market which is going to be shrinking in the future. And this is a debate which is just emerging in Mexico. It's fascinating. Mexicans who have always said, those damn Yankees are always trying to get hold of our oil, are gradually waking up to the fact that in 5 or 7 years' time, the Americans aren't going to need their oil. What's even more critical is that the places where they currently send oil to be refined and then to be re-imported into Mexico, those places are probably going to be occupied by oil that's coming from Canada or from the United States itself. Mexico's in a difficult situation. It's going to have to find new refining capacity either nationally or throughout the hemisphere or globally where its crude oil can be refined to turn into petroleum products. Shoot forward, if you don't mind, to 2020. Canada's going to be a massive energy exporter. The United States is not going to be enough for it, and so it's going to have to find, as I put here at the end, diversified markets. A largely free market again, stable production. I think that they'll reach that close to 5 million barrels a day mark, and they're going to hold there. And that's going to be an enormous, going to make Canada an energy superpower. The United States of America, an energy exporter. Now, we may reach the point where we're level in terms of oil, but we're going to be exporting gas. Sometimes to Mexico, but sometimes in the form of LNG to the rest of the world. A largely free market. The debates about do we restrain natural gas exports and crude oil exports, I think those are going to be a thing of the past in 7 years' time, because the private sector is going to say, look, we've got all this energy, what are we going to do with it? We need to find a place for it. And particularly in light of one of the things that Governor Richardson said, which is about energy efficiency. Think about how this society here in the United States is being transformed and people are using less and less energy per dollar of GDP produced. Growing production, we should expect that we are going to become essentially the Saudi Arabia of the world. That's the extraordinary thing. In energy terms, North America has become the Middle East, and the United States is going to look a lot more like Saudi Arabia, at least in terms of energy production. And the United States is going to be seeking markets. Instead of seeking reliable supplies, it's going to be seeking markets. That's an extraordinary turnaround from just 5 years ago. For Mexico, Mexico is going to become energy independent. I predict that we will reach a point where Mexico eventually gets back up over the 2.8 to close to 3 million barrels a day produced, and it's going to be in a position where even with rising demand, it's going to be able to export a significant amount of its crude oil. Mexico may even get to the point where it's producing enough natural gas because it has enormous natural gas reserves, largely in shale formations throughout the country. But for the medium term, it's probably going to be importing natural gas from the United States. It's going to move to a mixed model. The state is going to be there. Pemex is going to remain. The national oil company will remain as a major player through joint ventures, but we're going to be reaching the point by 2020 where we actually can consider concessions. I know this is a crystal ball, which hopefully you all have forgotten about in 7 years when I'm wrong. But anyway, I think we're going to see the point where the market and the state play a joint role. Growing production, moving back up towards the 3 million barrels a day mark, and seeking new markets. That's where Mexico's going to be, looking not northwards, but maybe southwards, Central America. across the Pacific to Asia, exporting already. You see the recent talks between Mexico and China, signing very small oil deals to export up to 30,000 barrels a day, tiny amounts of oil to China. But that will grow as demand there grows. And if you just look at my last slide, these are 6 of the drivers that I see are most important globally in terms of what's going to happen in the hydrocarbons industry. The hydrocarbons revolution is, of course, crucial here. The shale thing that we talked about already. Reform and progress in Mexico, the gradual transformation to a market economy, increasing global demand. Whereas we may see shrinking demand in our region, in the United States and in Canada, we're going to see growing demand in the emerging markets of the world. That means that hydrocarbons, in particular liquid fuels from hydrocarbons, are going to remain crucial. But increasingly, the market for gas-powered vehicles is going to grow. Regional competitiveness, it's seen as being the key element here. If you have cheap fuel, then you have increased competitiveness. That's why so many American corporations are coming home today. That's why so many American corporations are looking at producing just across the border in Mexico. It's the lower cost of transportation, the lower cost of energy. The renewables leap, which we've begun. We saw it in Mexico over the past 6 years, the dramatic rise in investment in wind and now increasingly interest in the solar industry, but it's still very small, but it's happening. And by 2020, by 2030, we're going to see that renewables play a much higher role, much more important role in the overall energy matrix. And climate change and carbon, that's going to become something that on a regional basis we have to talk about. We need to make sure that any carbon regime that enters in any of the 3 North American countries doesn't impact upon trade relations between the 3. That's why we need to talk about carbon taxes. That's why we need to talk about cap and trade on a trilateral basis. Of those 6 drivers, I would say the one thing that's happening right now that you need to pay attention to is what's happening in Mexico. And the great thing is you don't have to pay attention for very long. This will all be done by Christmas, okay? So between now and Christmas, and probably by October, you're going to see this revolution that's taken place in Mexico that will create an enormously optimistic outlook for the future. And that outlook means that you can finally see the creation, not just of an energy community with shared values, but of energy markets that are regional. And that's something which we haven't had up to this point. Thanks for your attention.
Good morning, actually good afternoon. Thanks to Simon and NDN for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to share the stage with Duncan, who along with El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, we make up the Border Research Partnership. And then finally, a real honor to be here with Governor, Ambassador, Secretary Richardson, because energy is not an international issue, and energy is not a federal issue, energy is not a local issue. It is all those issues, and he has the expertise to talk across transcending these government jurisdictions, because that's really what it's all about. So I'm the one that gets to give some of the bad news and maybe a roadmap to the future. I remember the anecdote of the Washington tourist who was up in Maine and got lost and asked the Maine farmer, how do we get back to Washington? Well, the farmer thought for a few seconds and said, well, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. I'm not sure you can get back there. Well, I'm not sure, given where we are now, we can get to this vision of the future, because we are in dire straits when it comes to some of the mechanisms. I like to show this map. It's over 200 years old, but it really shows that the vitality of North America was really about the things that should flow across the borders. And so we have electrons, and we have petroleum, and we have other things that should flow across the border. Obviously, a lot of things that shouldn't flow across the border, but we're trying to do that. My message is that we really are at a moment in time, but there are so many things that are standing in our way. Number one being the 3 countries and all the provinces, 100 jurisdictions in North America, if you count all the states, provinces, territories. And there's just no way we can break this without due attention by the national leaders. The reason we're going in different directions is because we have these different jurisdictions that are all trying to optimize their return on investment. They're trying to export, they're trying to sell, they're trying to generate taxes on each of the things they're doing. And they really are starting from different places. But what we are advocating is a regional approach to North America, a continental approach to energy issues, where we become secure by becoming interdependent with each other. And at the same time, I think we need to talk seriously about climate change and greenhouse gases when we talk about exporting energy, exporting it out of a jurisdiction, across an international border, or certainly when we leave the continent itself. There was an article a couple of weeks ago with a picture of the governor, ambassador, secretary, and he was quoted as saying, again, he's talking about this third world grid that the United States and North America still happen to have, even though we're in a 21st century. And the fact that there really is no momentum for solving the problems. I mean, we've got these roadblocks that I'll talk about later. The lesson from Mexico and Pemex is there's going to be huge returns on the publicization, what I call it, of Pemex. The Economist, if you can believe what they say, is citing some of these great numbers on what's going to happen. And the lesson from Canada is from the damn fire. That was North Dakota oil that was headed for Maine to be exported to Europe that started on fire and killed all the Canadians. So the lesson is get it off of rail where it's largely unregulated, where it's very unsafe. Got 250,000 railroad cars running around North America today with petroleum on it. Get it onto a pipeline, and a pipeline going to North America as well as to China and the rest of the world. We've made huge progress on some hard nuts. I mean, the donut hole in the Gulf of Mexico, we could lecture about this, but there's now an agreement on it. But we have other transboundary reservoirs that can be tapped, and there's no regulation, there's no arbitration on who can tap how much of it. And then some of these reservoirs can be used for carbon dioxide, so we should be thinking about these issues in the future. And of course, I'm one of those who's a big proponent of renewables. The big reason for renewables for me is because the jobs and the entire industries and the careers that are around renewables. Some of the estimates coming out of some of the think tanks in California have truly impressive numbers about how many jobs will be supported by the development, the design, the construction, the maintenance, the operation of renewable facilities in the future. What once worked was when the secretary was the secretary. We had a North American Energy Working Group, and it would meet and it would talk and it would commission reports, and there were forum for moving progress. Under the Bush administration, it stopped. Under the Obama administration, it has not started up. Under the Obama administration, we had a President's Task Force for Cross-Border Electricity. It makes a lot of sense. How do you cite and finance and do environmental reviews on transmission that crosses a border? That task force went away. There was no leadership at DOE for moving forward on these things. So once again, I make an argument, a strong argument, that we approach energy challenges and energy answers from a continental perspective. And it's going to take, I think, the three leaders to do it. One of the hopes is the recent FERC rule that mandated you have to collaborate, you have to cooperate and collaborate with the other owners and operators. And just guess what? We already have transmission that crosses the border, which means we have to talk to Canada. We are talking to Canada. We have to talk to Mexico. We are talking to Mexico. The Arizona, California, Baja California blackout of last year was because Arizona doesn't talk enough to the Cal ISO and doesn't talk enough to CFE and CRE in Mexico. Whoops, let me just go back one. And I really do think the North American Leaders Summit in Mexico this fall is the place where the three leaders can be talking about some of the solutions. Don't forget the states. I mean, when we were supporting the Board of Governors Conference and their energy work table, it was all about they have a huge role in incentivizing, in permitting, in getting past the NIMBYism that so many of these energy problems are all about. The states absolutely have to be among the players there. So there's a Board of Governors Conference, there's a Board of Legislative Council, there's a Board of Mayors Association, the Board of County Commissioner Coalition. These meet regularly and can talk. They should be used by the feds and the internationals as they move forward on it. So what do we do about carbon? Well, I think, again, we need to take a continental perspective. And we're an advocate of a North American greenhouse gas emission reduction credit exchange. In other words, Canada needs to buy credits from U.S. Canada can buy them from Mexico to enable the three countries to continue to interexchange the petroleum that we all desire, but at the same time address the incremental greenhouse gases associated with the tapping of oil sands. Because these are positive meaning they're looping nesting systems. If we don't address carbon change, it's going to make it harder for us to develop energy. It's going to make it harder for us to do the stuff we have to do in the future because we've got this nesting loop. And my final thought is that, I mean, after being a pessimist for a couple of minutes, I will agree with Duncan that there are good times ahead because Mexico may hold the key to so many of the challenges. But thank you.
Do you have, is the other, so they can just do the handheld? Yeah. Okay, okay. Well, thanks to our main keynote speaker and the two respondents. A lot to chew on, a lot to think about. I learned a lot today, which is always a wonderful thing about working here, as you get to learn from such smart people. What I'd like to do is open it up to the room now, and you can, if you want to raise your hand, identify yourself. We have, the mic is going to do double duty, because we didn't take the time, because we're short on time to do lavaliers, so the mic will start out there and then come up here, right? So please raise your hand, I'll call on you, and if you can identify yourself and ask away. We're going to start, Jimmy, back here. Do you want to? Okay, bye.
Hi, I'd like to thank the panel. It was a great talk, and Governor Richardson, always good to see a Fletcher alum on a panel. So, you talked. Every panelist talked a little bit, or spoke a little bit about this tension between United States natural gas reserves and fracking and climate change. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the trade-offs that we should be willing to endure for developing those reserves, and how much climate change we're willing to see. And then on the flip side of that, how is that going to affect development of the renewables that everybody has mentioned? If we develop more of our own natural resources, is that going to hamper development of our renewable energy resources as well?
Well, I believe the whole debate on fracking has not ended, but it's good to be having it. Some states are having it with more difficulty than others. I recall giving a speech in New York where I couldn't get out of the hotel because there were anti-fracking demonstrators, just no fracking at all. In the West, quite a bit is happening in Colorado and my state. I don't know if there's a trade-off. I would call it a balance. You got to do it right. And this is where I believe the role of government, the role of science should dictate. Some of our universities, fracking, although it's been going on, the best kind of regulation of fracking isn't out there on horizontal drilling, on methane, on water, on what chemicals. I think we need a full board scientific review. I think the EPA can do it. They got some scientists, I think the National Academy Universities. But I don't think we should rush and say, okay, whatever natural gas company wants to do, we should do. That's what the natural gas companies want. And it shouldn't happen. There should be a balance. I think you made a very good point about states. I almost forgot that I was a governor. But you're right. States have a big role, especially in the absence of leadership on the part of the federal government. I haven't kept up on the fracking federal issue. I think EPA is doing some substantial studies, aren't they? They're okay, good. Let's just make sure they're right, and maybe they'll require legislation. Hopefully they can be done by executive order. You take it to the Congress, they won't want any and there should be. But shale gas, I think, is here to stay. I think it's good. It's clean, not entirely, but it's cheaper. Consumers like it. But I believe eventually it's going to be a bridge fuel to renewables. Now, let me just put one more boost for renewables. Even though you had the Solyndras and the loan guarantees probably in the Congress, I don't know if they'll be reauthorized, and people whining about renewables, especially the fossil fuel people. there's some real technological advances. And the most telling statistic is at the United Nations. I think there's 196 countries registered as countries. Over 140 of those have said publicly their energy future is renewables. So I see shale gas and gas being eventually a bridge to renewables. It's probably going to be a while, 2040, 2050, but that's the way I see it worldwide.
I think it's one of the crucial questions about shale gas right now is, what is its relationship with climate change? Being a much less carbon-intensive fuel, I think it's, it offers us an enormous step forward. The key challenge, I think, is going to be to get more transportation. Think about how we move goods in our region and how much transportation contributes to our carbon emissions. How do we get more transportation? I mean, heavy trucks, especially, to shift over to compressed natural gas or some such, application of natural gas. But certainly, I see it as a step forward. In terms of one of the questions that comes out sometimes with fracking is, what about leaks from shale formations and from shale operations? That is a serious problem. And I think that this is where, once again, we come back to the question of regulation. And regulation is far too often, I think, in this country, used as a dirty word. Regulation can be a very, very positive thing. It can help markets to mature. It can help the industry to move ahead. Think about how regulation has interacted with all kinds of industries over the last 150 years to actually move them forward in terms of health and safety standards and environmental standards. And the question is, I think we have to answer in this country is, who is what's the right level? Is it the federal level? Is it the state level, municipal level that is going to be best able to regulate? And in terms of the relationship with the renewables industry, it's a really serious problem, I would say, right now. Those of us who are fans of renewables would like to believe that the lower price of natural gas in today's markets means that you can have renewables plants that are generating electricity, and when for some reason the wind drops or the sun goes behind a cloud, that you've got a natural gas plant there to compensate for that drop in production. But it's still expensive to do that. Why would you, if you're looking to supply energy to a market, why would you build a renewable plant and a natural gas plant? Why don't you just build the natural gas plant, no? A combined cycle plant. It makes much more sense financially. And this is where I think you need to have some kind of incentive structure for renewables to make that possible, or rather to make it more probable. Or, you need to think seriously about where that carbon tax and when that carbon tax comes into play.
Just a quick comment on the water needed to frack. I think everyone forgets you need energy to have water. I know California spends 1 out of every 7 watts mining and moving, treating water, not heating it, and then disposing it. And then you can't have energy without water. I mean, the oil sands use an immense amount of water. Fracking uses an immense amount of water. And then just again, the point that climate change and water and energy are always related. So unless you're thinking about water when you think about approving fracking, you're going to end up in a predicament.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Rob Colorina, AIAC Investment. I think the ambassador touched upon some of the regions, but maybe a little bit more in this Q&A, a little bit more developed. My question relates to the emerging markets and how BRICS have combined, the resources of Brazil, Russia, India, China, Southern Africa. And I think notably Russia wasn't mentioned as much. You have, Gazprom and Rosneft. Views on that as to, the North American strategy on that.
Anybody want to?
Well, this is another region. This is another reason why we need a North America energy community. Not look at it as fierce competition, rivalry, but as part of an emerging market challenge that is real. Although I haven't seen, I know they've also, the BRICS countries have talked about like a World Bank. I don't know if that's formed yet, because you have to finance a lot of these projects. But I think that's another reason, and especially because we don't want Mexico to join BRICS. We want it to, it might anyway. Mexico, I think, as a country, or maybe it's Canada that has the most free trade agreements with anyone. Does anyone know that? Mexico, like they have 200 of them? Well, let's not overdo it. But so, you know what's very interesting about the BRICS countries is they have the potential. The issue is it going to happen like Nigeria? If they put their oil out there, and it's a joint operation, what does that do to Nigeria's membership in OPEC? They'll probably stay, but they might look elsewhere. India, China, we haven't talked about China and Latin America. China has a lot of investments in Latin America, but not too many in energy. I checked that out. They have some. They have some in the Caribbean. I mean, you go to a Caribbean country and the Chinese are everywhere in every sector, building soccer stadiums, but with Chinese workers. So I think you have to watch that but that's an excellent question.
Why don't we do Rick and then Duncan? Go ahead.
Just a very brief comment. I mean, I'm skeptical of energy agreements that exist between countries that are in radically different parts of the world, and where you see that they are, that there's real potential for competition and conflict between them as well. So, I mean, you see that Russia and China have signed a number of energy deals, and that makes a lot of sense given the fact that China is desperately looking for sources of energy, and Russia has the surplus to export. But India's in a radically different situation. South Africa, looks very, very different as well. And Brazil is, of course, has become energy independent, or at least it has achieved oil independence in recent years, is currently going through really tough times. And to come to any kind of agreement on energy that means anything, I think is really complicated. What you do see, however, in the region of North America and in the Americas in general is you see the potential for developing a truly regional approach to an energy strategy. And not thinking just to 2020, but thinking to 2050 and beyond. When you eventually make that transition to renewables, to a low carbon future, how do you actually make sure that every region of the region, every part of the region has electricity when it needs it? Because that's what the future is. It's electrons, isn't it? I mean, it's not so much that we're going to be moving around, pumping gasoline into our cars. It's about having electric-powered pretty much everything. As we, think about how much electricity you consume today. How do you satisfy that? It's really difficult to imagine how we do it. We think about, rising demand for energy. And in particular, when you think about how energy cycles work on a daily basis, peak demand, when does that occur? Well, it occurs very differently in different parts of the country. And so one of the most exciting things that I've heard about recently is the development of offshore wind facilities off the coast of Galveston. And the reason why that's so important is because just when the wind installations in Sweetwater, Texas are beginning to wind down for the day because the wind patterns are dropping, the wind patterns are picking up in the Gulf of Mexico, and Galveston is able to satisfy that peak demand which is just picking up. That's the way that we need to be thinking, is that we have surpluses of energy in some parts of our region and we have deficits in other. How do we get those two things to interact with each other?
So the same economist who coined the word, or the acronym BRIC, also coined the acronym MIST for Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, and Turkey, talking about emerging economies. He's also the one who talked about the pigs, Portugal, India, Ireland, and Greece, the failing economies. Well, I want to tell you, last month I was in Milan talking to European investors who want to invest in Mexico renewable energy. So it's a huge emerging opportunity from their perspective. And I think the reason they invited me over is because they wanted to hear kind of an outsider's perspective on what the chance was. I was on a panel with 3 others. All of them were very bullish on Mexican renewables.
Maybe one more. We've had a long panel, and you got one last time. I want to hear. We'll go here. We'll get you next time. You get a frequent flyer card, I think, next year.
Thank you. Emily O'Connell with Rasky Barline Strategic Communications. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. My question should be quick. It's for Mr. Van Schoik. You mentioned the President's Task Force for Cross-Border Electricity, and if I heard you correctly, it has ceased to exist. And if that's true, and if there is a lack of leadership in the administration, if I understood that correctly as well, where do you see that coming from in the coming months and years? What agency, what office, who should be taking that lead?
Ambassador Pascual, the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, was the spearhead behind it. He's now at the Department of State as the Secretary Special Ambassador for Energy Diplomacy, for lack of another word. I would turn to him for leadership. And hopefully we'll have the presidents here before they go to the North American Leaders Summit.
Yeah, why don't we do this as, John,
I would say watch this space. It's about to start up again. So one of the issues, there are bilateral energy talks going on right now. And Mexico has actually requested that there's a new move on cross-border electricity. And so it's not going to be the same institutional deal as before, because every new administration wants to create its own system, right? But within the next few months, you'll see something emerge on that. And that's been driven largely, I would say, by Mexican companies wanting to export energy, renewable energy from Baja California to the United States, and by U.S. companies based primarily in Texas looking for increased capacity to export their cheaper electrons to the Mexican market.
Duncan, why don't we just, please, and just everyone just make final wrap-up comments.
There's a very good energy secretary, Ernest Moniz, who was my deputy when I was at Energy. This guy's a scientist. He knows politics. He's a professor. He's a nuclear weapons scientist. And he knows the bureaucracy. I think this guy is going to really revitalize the bureaucracy when it comes to climate change and some of these international dialogues. Because I think you mentioned, you were there, we had a North America Energy Council. Remember inviting all the energy ministers of Africa. I said, I'm going to take him to a Hispanic state. So we went to San Diego. You're probably saying, that's dumb. No, it wasn't dumb, it was smart. And we took the Latin American, Linda Lingo was with it. We took him to New Orleans, right? It was New Orleans. I wanted like an African-American state, right? Was it, or Atlanta, I can't remember where, but we had all the ministers there. And you know, when you have these dialogues and you pass resolutions, we actually got moving on some of these issues because of those meetings. I'm a great believer in personal diplomacy. I'm a believer in task forces, meetings, people talking to each other. I know all you people do is send emails and, you know, the
Tweet.
I've had to be on Facebook just to keep up with the days. I've stopped reading it when I keep getting insulted. But, you know, so I think these task forces are good. And you made a very good point about how this, right now, I think this first priority should be North America energy. Hopefully something will happen in that summit in Mexico.
And Duncan and then Rick, just any closing thoughts, Duncan?
Just very, very briefly, I mean, as I ended my intervention earlier on, you know, watch this space in terms of what's happening in Mexico. That's the crucial thing that's happening right now. And then we come to the next question. The next question is, okay, so Mexico goes through an energy reform. Fantastic. They change the constitution. Then we get to the writing of the secondary laws and the implementation, the creation of a regulatory framework. And all of those are going to be the crucial questions in determining how effective this reform is. And that's something which the ambassador has now left, but Mexico doesn't have a stellar record on, to be honest with you. I mean, it's the details of things. So you make these big leaps forward, and then you've actually got to really do the hard work of actually saying, how do you implement these reforms in practice? And so that's going to be the challenge, I would say, for the next 12 to 36 months.
I'm going to conclude the bullishness on Mexico. Like everyone else in the past, although I think Arturo's president tried on the cartels, did a lot of good things, but I think this guy, Peña Nieto, really is going to be somebody that's going to be a regional leader. I think he's going to, on policy, on issues like energy and Cuba, and all kinds of, I think, regional leadership that is needed. I think he's got the political skills of a Clinton. He's got the charisma of a Reagan. and I did say this, and I got in trouble in the Mexican press. I said he had the intellect of Obama. And people said, well, was I overdo it? I have nothing with, other than my friendship, and my mother lived in Mexico, my sister's there. But I'm very bullish about Mexico. I think if they move, and I think the three of us, what we share here is we're all really positive that something good is happening there. And we have to encourage it. We got to stop the whining. You know, everywhere you go, oh, I'm never going to go there. It's too risky. Yeah, right? It isn't risky. There's the immigration bill. There's less immigration now, Simon, right? Illegal immigration coming in. There's, God, we've got how many? 15,000 guards at the border? And they want to double it? It's not going to make much difference, but if it gets more votes, we should probably do it. A fence is worthless. They're going to go over the fence, under it. 10-foot fence, 11-foot ladders. But my point is that and this guy just grabbed Peña Nieto, cartel leader that no one had found before from the Zetas. He found him. He got him. You know, and he's bucking us a little bit. That's what I like. I mean, most Mexican president, oh yes, U.S., what do you want us to do? This guy saying, no, we're going to do it our way. Security issues, violence issues, we're going to deal our way. And I think that's good. We want a strong neighbor. Canada always gets forgotten. I'm glad there was good talk about Canada here. Any Canadians here? Good. Will you tell people that you shouldn't be. You shouldn't be. You're leaders. You're good. Thank you.
I'll just conclude with a factoid that I used to start an entire lecture series with, and it reflects Canada. Canada is our #1 energy friend. Mexico's #2. We import more from those two countries than any other in the world. In some cases, more than all the rest of them put together. It's a factoid no one knows, everyone forgets.
So I'll wrap up with a couple things. First of all, there is, for those of you who want to learn more about how Mexico is modernizing, the progress that we've made on our border between the United States and Mexico, what's happened with migration, for example, where we're at net zero today between the United States and Mexico. We have a mountain of material on our website that's been widely cited in the Atlantic and other newspapers and magazines in the last few weeks at ndn.org. And in fact, I'm doing a briefing. If you want to come back tomorrow and have more of those awesome potbelly sandwiches, I'm going to be doing a briefing here tomorrow and Wednesday, going through a PowerPoint presentation that takes you through the data, showing how much Mexico's changed. I mean, it's really remarkable, particularly since the passage of NAFTA in 1993. As somebody whose first major job that I had in the Clinton administration and working with the Clinton team in 93 after we won was working with Rahm Emanuel and Bill Daley to pass NAFTA, it is really amazing to look now in my career here 20 years later to see what a remarkable success NAFTA has been. And we're going to be going through the 20th anniversary celebrations over the next year about NAFTA, something we'll be participating in, our project with Emma, who's here today. We'll be working a lot in. So first of all, on data about the border, U.S. Mexico, our website. The second thing, and one of the reasons that I just personally am so interested in this topic, is around this concept of self-sufficiency. I mean, if we're really going through a global revolution in energy, and if renewables are going to become something that's happening in every civil society around the world, if we're going to see fracking and other technology advances allowing other countries to start taking advantage of what's underneath their ground in ways they couldn't before, you're talking about a much more globally distributed energy landscape in the 21st century than we had in the 20th century. And why does that matter? It matters because this concept of the curse of oil is, I still think, the most important. If you look at the U.S. today and what are our great threats that are out there, there's no question that the worst actors on the global stage are the countries that have the most oil. And this is a serious national security issue. And the idea that we could see much more distributed energy production throughout the entire world through this whole new landscape we're discussing has the ability to weaken or limit the curse of oil, however you want to talk about it, which still, you know, if you think about the investment we've made in blood and treasure around the world over the last 30 years. So much of it has been tied to this. And I think for our country, for our economic future, for the my kids are 12, 10, 7 years old, and I think about what their life is going to be like. How awesome would it be that we weren't in Afghanistan, we weren't in Iraq, we weren't in all these faraway places fighting things out over things that are related to the curse of oil, to see the end of that period of human history through this renewable and technology revolution. What a remarkable thing to even think about. And I hope that we can begin to bring the promise of that and to make sure that the U.S. is doing everything within our power, right, to accelerate that day, to make that day more likely, because it is, if you look at polling and if you just look at common sense, I mean, we are tired of the type of engagement around the world that hasn't worked out so well. I don't think America's shedding, I don't think we are in any way stepping back from the leadership that's required in a much more difficult world. But I think we want our investment to have better returns. And I think that one of the greatest national security investments we can make is the stuff we're talking about today. Terrific panel, great subject, great audience. Thank you for your wonderful questions. I particularly want to thank Governor Richardson, whose payment today was a great potbelly sandwich. I appreciate, and which he ate with great enthusiasm upstairs. But thank you, Governor, for making the trip, and Rick and Duncan, keep up the good work. Thanks, everybody, very much. Oh, great. I have to thank Laura, who put this whole event together today. Laura, thank you so much. Our summer associate, she's done a terrific job. And thanks, everybody.